Civil War and Reconstruction. The Constitution. Something's missing. The Constitution set up the rules of our government. The first 10 constitutional amendments, called the Bill of Rights, listed the rights that citizens should expect. But when these documents were written, over 1/3 of the population of the United States was not considered citizens. These were the slaves and free blacks living in the United States. They were born in the U.S., worked in the U.S., and died in the U.S., but were not protected by the founding documents or by state laws. It took a war between the states to bring changes to the Constitution that would end slavery and set a path for greater equality. States taking sides. We don't hear much about new states being added to the United States anymore, but in the early 1800s, several new states were added to the Union. One of the hot topics of the day was whether these new states would allow slavery, like the southern states, or ban it, like most of the northern states. Over time, these two regions had developed in different ways, which led to conflict. Check out the map to see which states allowed slavery and which didn't. Civil War. The debate over slavery and rights was a main factor leading to the bloodiest war in our country's history. The slave states in the South decided they would be better off as a separate nation, so they seceded from the United States. Secession means separation or breaking away. But President Abraham Lincoln did not want the nation to be divided. War began between the southern states, which called themselves the Confederate States of America, and the northern states, which were still known as the United States of America. President Lincoln led the United States during the war. The Confederate States set up their own government and military. This war between the states, now called the Civil War, deeply and bitterly divided America on both sides. Emancipation. In the middle of the war, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all slaves in the South were free. Emancipation means freedom. Although it was a huge and important step, it didn't have much immediate effect. It did not help slaves in the South because Confederate States of America had its own government and did not feel bound by proclamations by the United States President. It also did not help slaves in states that had not seceded. Even so, the Emancipation Proclamation was a big deal. Although it failed to free any actual slaves, it did send a strong message. When the war was over, slavery in the U.S. would end. The U.S. government took this as a sign to move forward with additional laws that changed citizens' rights in America. Ending the war, ending slavery. In January 1865, 3 months before the war ended, Congress passed the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, outlawing slavery in the United States. The war ended when the Confederacy surrendered in April 1865. After that, all states were once again part of the United States of America. In December 1865, slavery was finally abolished in the entire United States when the last state ratified, or passed, the 13th Amendment. Reconstructing a nation. President Abraham Lincoln was said to have saved or preserved the Union by winning the war to keep all the states together. But when the war left much of the South destroyed and disorganized, the southern states needed to be made part of the United States again. The new president, Andrew Johnson, believed the southern states should be let back into the U.S. with no consequences. But many in Congress wanted to make sure the southern politicians were punished for seceding. They also didn't want southern politicians to interfere with the new freedom of African Americans. This period of rebuilding after the Civil War is known as Reconstruction. Many in the South resisted the changes, and the federal government had to send troops to enforce the new civil rights laws. Changing the Constitution. The 13th Amendment did not end the former slaves' troubles. Many southern states quickly passed laws to restrict what little freedom the former slaves had. Something more was needed to expand and protect the rights of the former slaves. As part of the Reconstruction effort, Congress added 2 more amendments to the Constitution. In 1868, the 14th Amendment guaranteed citizenship to all people born in the United States. This amendment also gave all citizens the right to due process and equal protection under the law. In 1870, the 15th Amendment gave all men the right to vote regardless of their race or whether they had been slaves before the war. Due process. Due process means that people have the right to be treated fairly by the government. There are 2 kinds of due process. One has to do with what the law actually says. Laws must be fair and reasonable. The government cannot pass laws that unfairly limit people's life, liberty, or property. The other type of due process has to do with how laws are enforced. Government officials must make sure must follow certain rules or procedures when they enforce laws. They cannot take away or limit someone's life, liberty, or property without following those rules. Equal protection. Equal protection under the 14th Amendment means the government must treat people equally. Unreasonable discrimination by the government is not allowed. If a law does treat one group of people differently, the government must prove there's a good reason for it. Courts will decide if that reason is good enough to let the law stand. Both equal protection and due process were rights that African Americans lacked due to their race and former state of slavery. By granting these rights, as well as the right to vote, the Constitution expanded citizenship to a whole new group of Americans. And let's take care of our review activities for today. We'll start with vocabulary. Use the word bank to complete each sentence. Our words are due process, secession, Emancipation Proclamation, equal protection, and Reconstruction. Number 1, in the blank, Lincoln announced that all slaves in the South were free. So that keyword there is free. What talks about freedom? Well, we know that the Emancipation Proclamation was a really, really big deal that, in theory, freed the slaves. So we're going to use the Emancipation Proclamation. The period of rebuilding after the Civil War was called blank. Well, the key word there is rebuilding. So use that word rebuilding to help you pick the correct word from up top. I'm going to help you out and pick out the keyword for our next one. The blank crisis occurred when 11 southern states declared their independence from the United States. And that important one is declared their independence. By declaring their independence, what were they doing? They were doing something, and pick from those remaining words. All right, our next one talks about taking sides. Match the quote with who probably said it. So we're talking about northern abolitionists, people who didn't like slavery, a southern slave owner, or a poor southern farmer. Let's look at that first one. I grow cotton, but I can't afford to own slaves. If they are freed, they might try to take my job. So who would be mostly concerned about that? Well, the abolitionists in the North, there's no slavery going on. A southern slave owner, I don't think they're too worried about competing, so I'm going to go with the poor southern farmer. Next one. I think slavery is terrible. Slavery is not needed and should be illegal. The government needs to do something about this. So if you look at here, the biggest thing is saying slavery is illegal. So would the abolitionist who's against slavery or the southern slave owner who benefits from slavery, who would say that? The last one, slaves are necessary to my cotton business. The government shouldn't tell me how to run my plantation. So you can use process of elimination to figure that one out. And our last one for this part, Confederacy or Union. Connect the person or term with the correct side of the war. So we have the North, the United States of America, and we have the South, the Confederate States of America. So I'll start with the first one, President Abraham Lincoln. Well, that should be really easy. That's going to be the North. A couple other things we're going to try to match are the soldier nickname, Billy Yank, which was a nickname for a Yankee. We have President Jefferson Davis, the national capital of Richmond, Virginia, a soldier nicknamed Johnny Reb or Rebel, and the national capital of Washington, D.C. So another easy one is Johnny Reb. You think about a rebellion, somebody who's leaving a country. Well, the Confederate States were the army that was rebelling against the United States. Letter D, name that amendment. Select the correct Reconstruction Amendment from each item. Former slaves and men of all races can vote. Well, that's going to be the 15th Amendment, because that's actually wrong. Oh, no, that's right. 13th is ending slavery. 15th is guaranteeing the right to vote. If you are born a U.S. citizen, you are a U.S. citizen. That's an example of the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing equal protection to all people born in the United States. Let's look at the next one. Slavery is illegal in the United States. The key word there is slavery. That should help you out. And then our next one, former slaves are protected by the law and considered citizens. Well, it's all about citizenship and who would be able to be protected under the law. And the last one, due process and equal protection are guaranteed to all. Take care of that one on your own. Letter E, impacting the future. Which of the three Reconstruction Amendments do you think had the greatest impact? And explain your answer. So that one, you take the 13th, the 14th, or the 15th, and you explain why you think it's significant. And I do want you to give me a good answer for that one. And here we go on our last ones. We have F, is that fair? Based on the idea of due process, which remember, that means that the laws treat people fairly and they're enforced fairly. Based on the idea of due process, do you think that these laws are constitutional, right? Yes or no? People accused of a crime must be told what crime they're being accused of. Well, it kind of makes sense that if you're being told if you're in trouble, that they'll tell you why you're in trouble. So, and that is, yes, people accused of a crime should be. That is definitely fair. People are only allowed to vote if they can pass a reading test. Well, just because you're not able to read well enough to a level that somebody says doesn't mean you shouldn't be allowed to vote. That's not really fair. So I'm going to go with no on that one. The next one, number 3, the government can disconnect your television service if you're watching unapproved programming. So I want you to think, is that fair? Is that not fair? Number 4, a school that suspends a student must notify the parents and give a reason for the suspension. So think, would you just want to be suspended for no reason, or is that okay for them to do that? People who look irresponsible cannot get a driver's license. Well, it depends on definition of irresponsible, but do you think that's a good idea or a bad idea? And evidence obtained illegally cannot be used to convict somebody in court. I think we've talked about that one in the past, but give your best answer. And equality. Reach each fictional law and identify the group that is being discriminated against. Use the word bank for your answers. So just remember, discrimination is one of our key vocabulary words, so I hope you know the definition here. You are not allowed to work if you are over the age of 65. Well, anybody over the age of 65 is usually considered a senior citizen. So that really wouldn't be fair to senior citizens. To help you out with the next 2, people of different races have to go to different schools. So I want you to think, is it fair? Who would that be targeting? And then public buses and trains have to be accessible or do not have to be accessible to people with wheelchairs. So if you think about people in wheelchairs, which of those categories would they fit in? And then women cannot teach school if they are pregnant. So again, think about that one. So we have a couple of things going on in this one. And it's crazy to think that all of this is based on slavery and the fact that we fought a very bloody war over slavery. So go ahead, finish up this activity, and then we'll have a better idea of what's going to happen whenever we continue and talk about what society was like after slavery ended. So go ahead and get started. If you have any questions, please ask.